Okay, for the next 6 assignments, we are going to continue this journey that we've begun of looking at and thinking about, how we make decisions about what is right and wrong. Now, I want to warn you, the next 3 or 4 readings are going to be very difficult to read simply because they're very old. They're, from 200, 300 years ago. The language is sometimes difficult. Plus, I've just taken a small excerpt out of a much bigger work, and so sometimes that makes it a little confusing. But if you'll just bear with these next few readings, I promise the language, the reading, the material gets a lot easier. And the reason I'm having you read these few that are very difficult to read is because they're works of very famous philosophers, very basic readings for philosophy course. And since this is counts as a humanities course, half of the course is general philosophy, and then we'll switch into the business topics, applying that general philosophy to business topics. Now, in this video, I actually want to talk about 2 of your readings together. And the reason that I want to do that is because I want to compare and contrast the two. I'm going to do that with the next few readings, talk about a couple at a time. Now, again, what we're trying to do here is start to build a base, and the way that we're going to do that is we're going to look at what a lot of other people, a lot of very famous philosophers, how they have approached the idea of deciding what is right and wrong, and how that impacts us as individuals, how that impacts us as societies, how they've approached it. And we're going to kind of start with their base, look at how other people think about things, and then we're going to start to talk about how, we interpret that, how we think about it. Now, your next 2 articles are Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes and Of the State of Nature by John Locke. Now, those 2 readings are in the packet that you bought at the bookstore. They're not in your book, they're in that packet. And again, this is just an excerpt out of a longer writing by these two. These 2 philosophers are very famous philosophers. If you want a little background information on them, you can Google them, internet search them, and you'll see that they have libraries full of writings. We're just looking at a very, very small portion of it. And also, guys, over the next few readings, what I'm going to do is I'm going to approach the readings from a very specific point of view to kind of start you thinking along a certain path. Now, I'm not trying to only make you think along that path. I'm just trying to pick out small things of each of these readings so that we can look at different topics. So when you read these assignments, if you get something completely different out of them than what I talk about, that's perfectly fine. You just focused on something different than I have, and that's great. I'm just picking out certain things so we can talk about kind of different angles of approaching this right and wrong issue. Now, with these 2, Leviathan and Of the State of Nature, with Hobbes and with Locke, the reason that I'm going to talk about these 2 together and what I'm going to compare is these 2 philosophers, at the very base of their thoughts, have a commonality in that these 2 philosophers believe that we as human beings are born with this innate nature. If you want to call it an instinct, we're born with this overriding instinct. And that one overriding instinct is what basically shapes our behavior as individuals, and our behavior as individuals is what shapes how our societies have to be structured. So since both of them have that same basic thought when they start their philosophy, that's what I want to talk about. Now, again, there's a lot of different things in their writings, but that's just the small angle I'm going to approach with these 2. Now, one of these writers thinks basically in very simplistic terms that our basic nature is bad. The other one thinks that our basic nature is good. Let me explain what I mean by that. Thomas Hobbes, he says that we have the bad nature. Now, he doesn't mean bad as in irredeemable, heathen human beings. He doesn't mean that. What he means is this. He says that the one overriding instinct that we are born with is the instinct to survive. And when he says the instinct to survive, he doesn't actually mean just physical survival. He means my one overriding concern always, whether it be in the forethought or in the background of my thought, is that I am concerned with my own comfort, safety, health, well-being. So it's not just physical survival, it's actually comfort and well-being. I'm concerned about me. And therefore, if left in a state of nature where we have no controls, if left to our own devices, that overriding instinct where it's all about me will cause me to behave badly toward my fellow human beings. And that's why I kind of put it in terms of he thinks we're bad. So, for example, if two of us are stranded on an island and there's a limited amount of food, he says, if it's the most expedient way to the food, I would just as soon kill you as share the food with you. Now, does that mean that we're always going to be bad to one another? No, we're going to do whatever is in our best interest. So if it's in my best interest, if you're bigger and stronger than me, then it's really not in my best interest to try to kill you because you're bigger and stronger. So it's in my best interest to try to do something to be good to you so that you need me, so that you will share the food with me. So in that case, it would actually make us share. But he says that overriding instinct where it's about me most often drives us to be bad to one another. Because that overriding instinct where it's all about me drives us to behave poorly, then he says we need to structure our societies in a manner where we have a central control, very strong central control that sets down the rules for us and tells us how to behave so we can behave in an orderly fashion and live together in society and not destroy each other. He says if we don't have that very strong central control, that it's basically just always a state of chaos. And in a lot of his writings, he says that that strong central control and the rules have to be implemented under the threat of serious bodily harm or death. I don't know that he means that it always has to be that severe, but what he's saying is we have to lay down the rules and we have to say there's punishments if you don't follow the rules. Because if there are no punishments, if there's no threat to us for not following the rules, he says we'll revert back to that basic instinct and chaos again. We're horrible to each other. We're always at war. So he thinks we're bad. So we look at John Locke. John Locke, on the other hand, if Hobbes thought we were bad, then John Locke must be the guy that thinks we're good, right? So he thinks we're good. Now, the reason I say he thinks we're good is because he thinks, again, that we're born with this innate instinct. And he says our one overriding instinct is to be social. From a biological standpoint, some species are herd species, some species are loner species. He says we're a herd species. We want to be together. And he says because that's our overriding instinct to be together, to be in a social group, then naturally we're going to be good to each other. You know, he's kind of a tree hugger. Everything's great. We're going to be happy. We're going to be kind to each other. We're going to help each other because we want to have other people around us. That's our one overriding instinct, to be social. And in order to be in a social group, I have to be kind and good to the people in that group. Since our overriding instinct leads us to behave in a manner that is kind and good to one another, he says that our society can be structured in a manner where basically there's very little structure, there's very little control. He's kind of your democratic guy. We all make decisions as a group because we all have the same overriding need to be together as a group. So we all make decisions as a group. He says, yes, there is always going to be the occasion where somebody's going to, he usually says transgress. You're going to do something you shouldn't. So yes, there have to be some rules and there has to be a body that judges the person who's done wrong and metes out some kind of punishment. But he says that aberrant behavior is this bad behavior. He says most of the time we're all good. So nobody needs to be in charge and telling us what to do because we're going to behave in a manner that's acceptable just because we want to be around each other. But in the case where someone transgresses, then we need this kind of central body. And it's not just one person who lays down the rules and metes out punishment, but we do it as a group. We decide the rules as a group. We judge the person who's transgressed as a group. We decide a punishment as a group, a fair and just punishment. So like I said, he's kind of the democratic guy. He thinks we're good. Now, what is kind of the interesting thing about these two people is it seems like they have very different thoughts on how we behave and why we behave the way we behave. But I want you to think for a second what I just said. Hobbes says our overriding nature is me. It's all about me. So that makes me behave poorly towards you. Locke says our overriding nature is to be social. And because I want to be social, then I know I have to be good and I'm going to be kind to everyone because I want them to be around me. But let me ask you this. I want you to be around me. I want to be in a social group, so I will be good to you, so you will be around me and I can be happy. Doesn't that sound like Hobbes? It's all about me. I think at the very base of these two philosophers, they actually believe the same thing. The entire world is all about me. I'm going to do what makes me happy. I think the difference in the two philosophers is the way that they believe that manifests in our behavior. You know, Hobbes believes that manifests in our behavior, behaving poorly towards one another, whereas Locke believes that manifests in behavior where we're going to behave very well towards one another. So I think in actuality, their basic theory is the same of, you know, we're born with this innate instinct, and that shapes our behavior. That shapes how, you know, how we behave and what we think is right and wrong, everything from there. That shapes our how we organize our communities, everything. I think they actually have the same idea of what that overriding nature is. It's me. It's about me. I want to be happy. I want to be comfortable. But again, I think they veer drastically in how they think that manifests as far as how we behave because of that. Now, which is right, which is wrong, you know, I don't know. That's what you guys are going to think about. And hopefully when you read, that's what you're going to write about. And when you blog, maybe that's what you're going to discuss, or maybe you'll find something completely different to discuss. As I told you, that's perfectly fine. But it's very interesting to look at, you know, they say it's just something we're born with. We can't really help it. And they have different ideas of how they think that makes us behave. You know, you may look at society and come up with your own conclusion as to which is right or which is wrong. Maybe it's a blend of the two. Again, that's what I want you to think about. That's what I want you to ponder. A little additional food for thought, I guess, in this area is this. And this is something we're going to talk about throughout the semester. You know, what shapes our beliefs, what helps us build our own personal set of ethics or morals. It seems, if you look at the background, the history of these two authors, that how they lived, where they lived, their early lives has a tremendous impact on what they think. Both of these philosophers were born in England. There's this overlap in time of when they lived. I don't have the exact dates written down. If you guys are interested, you can look those up. There's an overlap in time, but I can tell you this. Thomas Hobbes was born in the city, in London. During his lifetime, there was basically a perpetual state of chaos in England. They were at war constantly. There was the plague. There were fires destroying part of the city. There were all these awful things happening, and at that time they had a very strong monarchy. And the monarchy, if you did something wrong, which in their eyes was something that, you know, they didn't want you to do, if you did something wrong, then they hauled you in, they put you in the tower, they tortured you until you confessed to what you had done. Then they took you out and executed you in a very public manner. And they say, you know, by historical documents, that these public executions were almost like a social event. You know, it's kind of like the carnival comes to town. Everyone would gather in the town square, so to speak, and they would pull the offender up, you know, on the dais, and they would make him confess his sins, and then they would mete out the punishment of execution. And they generally didn't just, you know, quickly execute them. It was generally some kind of very brutal execution. And once they actually killed you, then they weren't through with you. Once they killed you, they dismembered you and they dispersed the body parts throughout the city. You know, there were a couple of main entrances to the city because it was fortified at that time, so people couldn't attack it. And at the main entrance, they would have a pike with your head on it. And at some other point in the city, they might have an arm or a leg, but scattered throughout the city and at the entrances to the city, they had these reminders of what would happen to you if you disagreed with the government, if you didn't do what you were supposed to do, if you didn't follow the rules. So it goes back to his theory of we had to be controlled under this very strong threat of serious physical harm or death. That's how he grew up. That's what he saw. And if it's kind of a social event when someone gets killed and dismembered, we all go to the town square, and they say there would be vendors, you know, going through the crowd and selling chestnuts or whatever it is that they sold those days, you know, meat products, whatever it is. So it was like a kind of a carnival atmosphere. Even though it was a horrible thing that was happening, that was like their entertainment. And if you were a child growing up in this environment where basically we have this social event when these horrible things are done to someone. And then I have these daily reminders. I go down to the store to get some bread for mom and I see Mr. Smith's leg on a pike. And I know that that means that Mr. Smith did something bad. And this is what happens when you do something bad. If you have this kind of behavior as a daily part of your life, and it seems very acceptable because the adults are actually making a social event out of these things, obviously you know that we're acting horribly towards one another, but you start to think, well, that must be the way it has to be. We must be terrible human beings if somebody has to do this to us. We must act horribly if they have to threaten us like this and punish us like this. But this must be the way that it has to be because, look, we're all accepting it. We're all like making a social event out of it. So you can see how his surroundings, how the death, the constant chaos, the fact that we always were at war, the fact that we accepted this brutality, the fact that there was this very strong control, and apparently it seemed that's the way it had to be. It would seem that his surroundings had a, tremendous effect on how he thought we were as human beings. And that may very well be why his writing reflects that thought that, we revert to this bad behavior and we have to be controlled. On the other hand, John Locke, also in England, and like I said, overlap in time. He was born a little bit later than Hobbes, but still during his time, England was involved in a lot of war. There was a lot of, of death from illness and things like that. However, he didn't live in the city. He lived out in the country. And I want you guys to think about this. From Tonkawa to Enid, it's about a 50-mile distance. We can get in a car, we can be there in an hour. So we know what's going on. We have a TV, we turn it on, we see what's going on across the whole state. We see what's going on across the whole world. We know what's going on. 50 miles away, that's nothing. In their day, the only way to get 50 miles away was by horseback, by some kind of cart pulled by an animal. The roads weren't these nice paved, wonderful roads we have. They were these bumpy, rutted paths. So 50 miles distance was like a whole world away. You didn't even know what was going on 50 miles away. I mean, you knew our country was at war because, of course, eventually news gets out to you, and, we know what's going on with the entire country because we have contact with the royalty and all of that. But if I live out in the country, I live in a very different world. I live in a world where, kind of like it is in a rural area these days, I live in a world where if my neighbors need a new barn built, we all get together, everybody in the area, and we build a barn. It was very common to have, like weekly, very frequent social events where we all came to someone's house and we had a dance or we had dinner, we had social gatherings. That was very common. We knew that we were at war, but we didn't really see the war. We weren't in the city where the soldiers were coming back and we saw all the injuries and all the death. We didn't have the kind of illness that they did in the cities, because you have to think at that time in the cities, there basically was no sanitation. There was not running water. There was no bathroom. You went to the bathroom in these pots and then you dumped them into the street and they ran into the sewers. It was very unsanitary and it was very unhealthy. In the countryside, we didn't have that so much because we didn't have that massive population crammed into a very small area without the sanitation systems that we have now. You didn't have that so much in the country, so you didn't have the illness. You didn't see the illness constantly. When you walked down the road, you didn't see Mr. Smith's leg on a pike. They didn't have that out in the country. That was kind of the warning to the city people where the population was. So unless you went to the city, you really didn't see that. And usually when you were going to the city, it was for a brief amount of time and then you're coming out, so you're kind of isolated from it. So if you're a child growing up in the country, even though it's at the same time and the same things are going on, it was like two different worlds. You didn't turn on a TV and see what was going on in the city. And if you didn't go to the city, which the children didn't usually, you didn't see any of that. And so even though they lived at a very common time, he lived a very different life, a life where we cared about each other, we helped each other, we came together in social gatherings very frequently, we liked each other. And again, you may believe, you may see that his surroundings, his environment, his upbringing had a tremendous impact on what he thought we were as human beings. And that may very well be reflected in his thoughts about how we behave as human beings, how that innate nature manifests itself with us as human beings, and how, therefore, we don't really need to be controlled by this horrible, we could see that in the city things were bad, and things were bad because the way the king was acting in the city. We didn't get as much impact of that. And so he could see how that kind of a system was bad. We didn't need all that control. We were doing good out here in the country. We all liked each other. We helped each other. And so that, again, his experience has a tremendous impact on what he thinks about right and wrong and how we make those decisions. So, Leviathan of the State of Nature, good luck reading them. Again, if you get totally different things out of them than what I talked about, remember I just picked one very small thread to talk about to kind of compare and contrast, start to build our base of knowledge and our contemplation of this whole process. So have fun reading and have fun blogging. See you next time.